is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Several tribes are suing the Environmental Protection Agency and the Army Corps of Engineers for rolling back protections for clean water. The 2015 Clean Water Rule expanded the definition of water bodies protected under the 1972 Clean Water Act. Last year, the Trump administration repealed that rule and replaced it with the Navigable Waters Rule. The tribes say this new rule substantially narrows the definition of waters that are protected. Their lawsuit claims wetlands, streams, and groundwater are now open for pollution. The nonprofit environmental law organization Earth Justice is representing 6 tribes in U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona in Tucson. They include the Pasquayaqui tribe, the Quinault Indian Nation, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, the Tohono O'odham Nation in Arizona, and the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewas. In the Seattle U.S. District Court, Earth Justice is representing the Puget Sound Keeper Alliance, the Sierra Club, the Idaho Conservation League, and Mi Familia Vota. Charges are dropped against an Athabascan Chippewayan chief after the release of dashcam video of his arrest. First Nation Chief Alan Adam was left bloodied and beaten after being stopped by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for having an expired license plate. The arrest happened in March, and the chief was charged with assaulting an officer and resisting arrest. In an effort to get the charges dropped, Adam held a press conference to release cell phone video taken by witnesses at the scene. Afterwards, the dashcam video was released, and it showed the officer charging at Adam, tackling him to the ground and punching him in the head. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who called the video shocking. Adam says firing the cops won't solve the problem. He wants broader reforms. He says Aboriginal people make up 5% of Canada's population and 30% of the prison population. In South Dakota, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe is suing the Trump administration and 10 other federal officials for threatening to unlawfully shut down their health safety checkpoints. The lawsuit says officials have threatened to assume control over the tribe's law enforcement and to withhold coronavirus relief funds from the tribe if they don't take down the checkpoints. The tribe says the checkpoints have helped them track individuals who have returned to the reservation from hotspots. In the lawsuit, they say to date, they've had no COVID-19 deaths on their reservation. Indian Country Today database shows the tribe has a total of 6 positive cases on the reservation, but only 4 of those remain active and no deaths. While in the state, South Dakota is reporting more than 6,000 positive cases and at least 80 deaths. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is accused of threatening to withhold the remainder of the coronavirus funding during a phone call on June 9th. The lawsuit was filed Tuesday in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. And now for an update on coronavirus cases in Indian Country, let's go to our Washington editor, Jordan Benebigay. Jordan?
Yate Patty, Yate Shikisto Shidine. We have updates from 8 tribes across the country, including 1 tribal health organization in Alaska. And here are our latest numbers from the database. There are 11,191 positive confirmed cases and 461 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 11,191 positive cases and 461 deaths as of June 25th. And in North Carolina, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians reported 3 additional cases in its first death. This gives the tribe a total of 62 cases and 1 death. In Mississippi, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians accounted 2 additional cases and 1 more death, bringing their total to 881 cases for the tribe and 63 in total. And the Cherokee Nation, Oklahoma, is reporting more cases, and this is a state where there's a surge in COVID-19 cases. So they have 3 more cases, which gives them a total of 169, but just in the last 2 weeks, they had around 100 cases, Patty. So it's interesting to see this trend going on here. And in Nome, Alaska, the Northern Sound Health Corporation reported another case. This gives the tribal health organization 7 cases altogether. And in New Mexico, the Kiowa Pueblo reported 11 additional cases. And the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community Arizona has 34 more cases, and they have a total of 98 cases overall, too.
So we continue to see that rise in the number of cases, but of course that also correlates to how many tests are now being given in Indian country. Jordan, thank you so much.
Okay.
And we'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome back. If you attended Iowa State University, Ohio State University, the University of Florida, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Washington State University, or the University of Arizona, then you have attended one of the many land grant institutions that benefited directly from the violent taking of Indian lands. After a 2-year investigation, High Country News published an article in March called Land Grab Universities. It lays out the plan the US government used to take lands from tribal nations and create endowments for these universities that still exist today. One of the investigative reporters who worked on this story is Tristan Atone. He was the associate editor at High Country News when the article was published. Welcome, Tristan.
Thanks for having me.
There's a lot of ground to cover in this story, so let's give some background first. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln was a busy man, wouldn't you say? The first act he signed was the Homestead Act. Tell us what that meant to tribes.
Well, there are a number of acts that Lincoln signed in 1862, the Homestead Act, the Railroad Act, and the Morrill Act. All of these acts were essentially land distribution acts designed to open the United States and the Western U.S. to, or what is currently the Western U.S., to white settlers. What we did in our investigation is focus specifically on the Morrill Act, which distributed public lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges and universities across the country.
And this, and they all tie in because, again, that was the bottom line for all of those acts, is taking land from tribes. And so the Homestead Act that Lincoln signed allowed settlers to occupy land for 5 years, and if they did that, then they would get that land. But what the act doesn't talk about, any of these acts, is what happened to the people on those lands. Tell us a little bit about some of those tribes who were displaced.
Well, yeah, those acts basically worked by turning land taken from tribal nations and turning them either into property for people to settle on, or turning them into property that could be then parlayed into seed money for higher education, or for railroads and corporations to use to build railroads. At center of all of these acts, as you mentioned, there's no mention of where that land came from. So, you know, the fact that to open this land or acquire this land, the United States either had to, you know, sign treaties with tribal nations or seize lands outright. You know, there are a number of ways in which, as we know, the federal government came into the possession of those lands. Almost every time through duplicitous means of some sort or another. But the land actually has to transfer from a tribal nation or an indigenous community to U.S. hands. These acts are the second step in that process. By once the land has been given to the United States or comes into U.S. hands, then it's used in various purposes.
And treaties are legal documents, and so by signing a treaty with a tribal nation, the U.S. government was acknowledging that land was belonged to the tribe, and yet when they signed these treaties and then turned them over to states, they didn't follow what was spelled out in the treaties in the sense of payment for the land.
That's correct. And what we looked at in our investigation was it was who was impacted and by how many different land cession events. We use the term land cession events because it's unratified treaties, it's ratified treaties, and it's land seizures. And what we found, at least with this section of the Morrill Act, was that it impacted about 250 different tribal nations, bands, and communities through about 160 violence-backed treaties and land seizures, which directly benefited 52 universities.
Now, and it's just amazing to see the list of universities that continue to benefit to this day, and from this act of 1862. The Morrill Act was officially known as an act donating public land to several states and territories, which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and mechanic arts. So a very nice sounding act, donating public lands. When you read that, how did your team respond to that particular phrase, donating public lands?
Well, I mean, as Indigenous reporters, I think we're all keenly aware of the history that a lot of U.S. citizens are not taught. So really, one of the keys to this project was just understanding that the public lands came from someplace, that they didn't just sort of like arrive in the lap of the federal government. And that's really the process that we're trying to untangle, is by identifying the lands that universities receive to fund their endowments. We can tie those to specific Indigenous bands and communities, and start adding dollar amounts to what was gained by those universities and how tribal nations were often taken advantage of. So, you know, as you mentioned, a lot of universities are still benefiting from this act. In some cases, that's surface and mineral rights that a number of universities still have at the moment. As well, the initial money that was made off of these indigenous lands by law is still in their bank accounts. Now, whether or not that money has been mixed in with larger endowments, you know, they're small endowments by comparison to what universities have today, but they are still on the books, and under law, the university has to keep them on the books. So, you know, using some forensic accounting methods, we were able to track down you know, some accounts and find them. We know that there are reporters working in Massachusetts, for instance, to locate those accounts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we have other stories that are coming out, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, that look at those mineral and surface rights and how much money that those universities have collected, even just in fiscal year 19, let alone the last 100 years.
It's you know, again, as you mentioned, as Indigenous people, we know our history. We know, you know, what has happened to our tribal homelands. But what kind of reaction have you had from non-Native readers to this story?
Well, you know, one of the biggest things that we kind of see in conversations that are happening, at least online, are non-Indigenous readers saying, you know, I sort of always knew that this was a situation, but could never actually sort of link the two ideas. And I think that's kind of a common theme that we see, is that when you think about where land would have come from in the United States, I think that at least a good majority of even non-Indigenous people, when pressed, like, understand that there were original caretakers here. What those processes were, what those legal processes were, and the fact that those communities are still here and around, and the universities that benefited from them are obviously doing very well. To some degree, it's just joining those ideas, and I feel like we've been able to do that with our data and mapping. So that's kind of been the biggest reaction we've seen. We haven't seen almost any reaction from universities. At least when this story came out was at the first peak of COVID really you know, hitting the U.S. So a number of universities said that they were dealing with COVID and couldn't respond, but since then we haven't actually still seen any response. What we have seen are student organizations and associations across the U.S. starting to press their institutions to recognize this history. In the case of University of Florida, for instance, the Student Senate have passed a resolution for the university to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would deal not only with the university's history of slavery, but also expropriation based on our reporting. We hear the same thing is going on over at University of Arizona. University of California is starting to have that conversation as well. We've seen organizations like the Librarians Association at the University of California begin to talk about how this data can be used. Wisconsin has talked about setting up land buyback programs to reimburse tribal nations whose lands were taken for the university. We're seeing a lot of really interesting conversations happening. And we know that there are at least 3 to 4 new in-depth stories that are coming out based on this data from news organizations around the country. So with COVID in some ways leveling off coverage-wise, we're beginning to see another second push on this data and reporters using it to hold universities accountable and tell a story that I think a lot of non-Indigenous people just don't know that's out there.
Well, so it's interesting, the timing of the release of this investigative story, the investigative report. You know, we're in this global pandemic, but then what nobody could predict was this civil unrest that's going on across the country, and the removal of Confederate statues, the removal of colonizer statues, and now we have this report from High Country News saying, hey, by the way, did you attend one of these universities? If you did, it's a land grant university. So do you think that's playing a part in more interest in this as well?
Yeah, I think so. You know, as we continue to see protests and demonstrations around the country and people grappling with, you know, the quote unquote unsavory bits of history and racist history that a lot of institutions are tied to, we're seeing an uptick, at least in interest in the data that we've created. Again, one of the goals of this project and this investigation was to make sure that we could provide essentially receipts for what universities did. When it comes to universities' history with slavery, there's been a lot of areas that researchers have not been able to even touch when it comes to finances. For a lot of researchers, it's almost impossible to put a dollar amount on what universities gained, you know, from engaging in the slave trade. In this case, we can be clear down to the cent exactly how much universities profited from expropriated indigenous land. As well, we made it a goal to make sure that all of our data was available for download. So any researcher in the world is able to download the data for free and use it in any way that they're needing to in their research. As well, we have a second website set up under landgrabu.org where users can go and explore the data through interactive maps and visuals. So if you want to see University of Arizona, for instance, and what their footprint is in the Morrill Act and what tribal nations they've impacted, you can take a look at that. If you are a tribal member, say you're Yurok, for instance, you can go to the page set up for your tribal nation, and you can see what universities profited from your land. So we've really tried to make sure that those receipts and that data is easily accessible, freely accessible, so that it can inform those conversations to as close detail as possible.
Give us an example of one of the most egregious cases you found, land that was taken and no money was paid for that, even though they had a treaty.
Well, University of California has been one of the biggest and potentially most egregious. We have a fairly large section in the story looking at University of California. You know, University of California is one of the universities that could take land from within their state boundaries. There are basically 2 kinds of land grant schools. There are schools that take land from inside their territorial boundaries, and there are script schools, which are East Coast schools that were essentially given vouchers for land in the West. Those vouchers are known as script. Cornell obviously took the largest amount of land and made the most amount of money, and they're spread across the country. But University of California is obviously in a state that was formed off of 18 unratified treaties. So not a single dollar was paid to any of the tribal nations that were impacted by the state of California being founded. And the University of California was able to get its start and stay in business essentially from that gift of expropriated land. We open the story as well with the story of Ishi, and many Californians and indigenous people are familiar with Ishi's story. But what we were able to discover in looking at the records and doing the investigation was that while Ishi was in hiding, the University of California essentially was given the land and sold it out from underneath him while he was in hiding, then used a portion of the money to pay him to sweep their halls. It's an egregious story. It's just one of the hundreds of stories that I think are available to other reporters and researchers who want to dig into this data. The University of California does still have approximately 440 mineral acres that they manage that are associated with this land. And while they're not making a ton of money off of it, I think it was nearly $2,000 over the last 3 or 4 years off those mineral acres. That's definitely not the case in other places. For instance, Montana State University, they still have 63,000 surface acres that came from this act, and almost 78,000 mineral acres, making a combined total of almost $700,000 in fiscal year 19 alone. That we were able to find in our investigation. Almost 24 universities continue to make money off of this land, which I think raises questions about if the land you have was stolen and you continue to make money off of it, as a university, do you choose to do something about that, or do you continue to ignore it?
Well, and then we look at the numbers of Native students in universities, and we're not graduating our Native students. We're at the lowest in graduation and retention rates, and then you hear about how do these universities, not all of them, but many of them, have our land grant institutions. So it's just that it's like a story that really needed to be told. Now in the South Dakota State University, they have turned around and are using their land grant money to benefit students.
That's correct. And we've heard some calls for other universities to follow their lead. South Dakota State University has presented on this in the past. Other land grant universities, as far as I understand, are familiar with their work and their position on how to use those Moral Act monies to support Indigenous students. Again, the question is whether or not universities will acknowledge their past or their history or that data that we've been able to put out publicly. There's a very small amount of Native students and faculty and staff at universities that were founded off of expropriating land from those Native student, faculty, and staff's ancestors and tribes.
And it's kind of ironic because I grew up, went to college, and I had people telling me, "Oh, you get free college because the government pays for your education." And I had that asked to me many times or told to me, and of course the answer is no. That the government does not give us free education. And then to hear this side of the story about who really is benefiting. What's the proudest part for you in this investigation?
Well, I It was a really, really big team effort, working with everybody on this investigation. So it was great to be working with other Indigenous people on this investigation, like Margaret Pierce and Kaylin Goodluck. It was fantastic to be working with my co-author Robert Lee, who had done this research and basically was the brains behind this research. But I think again is being able to actually provide receipts, paperwork, geographic areas, GPS locations. I mean, this data is accurate down to the GPS location of where this land is and how much money was made off of it, who it belonged to, and who it was given to. And I think that there's a lot of power in being able to present that data and those receipts to institutions. Again, I think the question is whether or not those institutions will actually recognize that history. But I do believe that we're at least at a starting point for students, advocates, activists, educators, etc., to start holding their institutions accountable. And we're seeing it, and we're hoping that there will be more coverage and more stories and more action taken by universities to address this.
All right, and we can put a link to your article in our on our platform as well. So Tristan Atun, one last closing thought on this investigative piece.
Yeah, I do hope that everybody takes a moment to read it and explore the data on LandGrabU. There are hundreds of thousands of stories to be told out of this data set, and we have tried to make it as open as possible so that readers and audiences can dive in and tell their own stories. And we hope that you'll be able to do that in the future.
All right, Tristan Atun, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Thalohungva. Join us again tomorrow.
This is Indian Country Today.